to let my mentor come in. You know, I went to UC Irvine 30 years ago, and this is my mentor. I always like to tell students in college, you know, you wanna get to know your faculty. This faculty member, when I was at UCI, was my mentor and has written every letter of recommendation for me, has been my reference for jobs. Can you believe for 30 years? 30 years. This means Professor Francis Wong for 30 years could be yours.
Maybe 30 days.
And I had mentioned to Professor Wong that my mentor was coming into town, and if he'd be willing, to let the Chinese American Identities course, have a guest speaker, and so Professor John Liu is going to actually give a guest presentation today.
What I thought I would do is put the Chinese American experience in a larger perspective, in a global perspective. Because a lot of times when we studied in the past the Chinese American experience, it was only about Chinese here in the United States. But we forgot that there are Chinese all over the world. And that Chinese were part of the beginning of globalization in the modern world. So when we talk about globalization, what do we usually mean by that? Anybody?
Feeling smaller.
The world, why is it feeling smaller?
Because communication and travel are easier and cheaper.
Communication and travel are decreasing. When did it first start? Well, we can actually put a time period on it. And this goes back to the 1830s. Because in the 1830s, Great Britain did something that changed the whole dynamics of migration in the world. They ended slave trade. Now, slavery had been illegal in the United States since 1808, but trading still went on. Great Britain in 1830 said, no more slave trade. The story behind that's complicated because of the abolition movement in England. But once that happened, Africans were no longer the major source of labor. They had to get labor from someplace else. So where did they go? Asia. Okay. Now everybody talks about 13 million slaves being sent to the New World and about 25 million people from Europe coming into the New World. Small next to the Asian immigration going out to the world. By 1945, it's estimated that there were more than 45 million Asian Indians that had been transported to different parts of the world. And there were about 25 million Chinese throughout different parts of the world. And where do you think they ended up? What determined where Chinese and Asian Indians were going to settle?
Where there was work?
Partly it was where there was work. It was who controlled the oceans? Great Britain and the United States. So it was those two countries that determined where most Asians actually settled. That's why if you go into the Caribbean, you go to Jamaica, you go to Ghana, you find all these Chinese, you go, what are they doing here? You go to Cuba, you say, what are they doing here? You go to Peru, what are they doing here? Okay. It's because they went where the American and British shipping lines went. And that began a global dispersion of Chinese and other Asians throughout the modern world. And then what's important to keep in mind is that the Chinese communities that grew up in different parts of the world were never isolated from each other. They always knew what was going on. Okay. Partly it was because of the Chinese press, but they also had to face common discrimination. Okay. What kind of common discrimination? Well, you got to the point where you know about the 1882 Exclusion Act, which denied the entry of laborers and their wives. Okay, it only allowed exemptions for merchants and everything. Was that an isolated incident? No. If you look at Canada, and you look at Australia, the other two major colonization where Asians went, the same thing. They had their own Exclusion Act. As a matter of fact, the Exclusion Act in 1882 in China influenced how Australia and Canada developed their exclusion laws. Later, when they developed the laws, the United States looked at it and said, we like what you did, we will copy you. And so you have this interesting dynamic where they're all communicating with each other and Chinese are informing each other about what's going on in the world. Okay. You can see that interconnection in another way. My friend and I, we did a study of Chinese between 1882 and 1930. Now this is known as a population distribution. Younger here, most working age people here, older here. All right? Now because of the 1880 Exclusion Act, you would expect this curve to get smaller and smaller because of the number. But you would also expect it to look like this as the population gets older. Remember, the Exclusion Act said workers could not come in. So you have supposedly having nobody replace them. So it should look like this. But when we looked at the census, thank you. When we looked at the census in 1900 and in 1910 and 1920, we noticed this hump never moved. Most Chinese stayed in the working age. So that can only mean one of two things. One, Chinese never age, we know it's not true, or they were being replaced somehow. How were they being replaced? Well, one method Madeline Hsu talks about is paper sons. That was certainly something that used to replace working class Chinese. But remember, replacing working Chinese with paper sons was a very expensive proposition. You had to create a family history, you had to teach the person, immigrant coming over, had to learn that family history in detail. Okay. Once they got to the United States, they could always be subject to being arrested and deported. So, the question is, if it wasn't all paper sons, how else were they coming? Well, remember, American shipping controlled the Pacific. And what they were doing was they were bringing workers to South America. But they always stopped where? San Francisco. San Francisco was the key port of entry. And so what we suspect is that the Chinese did a switch. They just said, you're old, you want to go, you go, we'll replace you with a younger worker. Which is why that distribution stays the same when it should have getting more and more skewed. Okay. This too required the cooperation of Chinese communities in other areas because they had to facilitate the transfer of Chinese from the boat to the community and back. You also see the distribution, the relationship between these Chinese communities in trade. Okay. When you take a look at the trade from China, a lot of it go into other Chinese communities and then came to the United States and vice versa, from the United States to these communities in other parts of the world. So a very, very sophisticated network, and it was all accomplished by the relationships that Chinese maintained with each other. And a lot of it was organizational. We've talked about the Chinese 6 companies. There were Chinese 6 companies in each of the major Chinese communities. And they were the ones who facilitated both legal and illegal activity. And they were damn good. Matter of fact, when we take a look at Mexican migration today, people say, oh, Mexicans are coming across the border illegally. True. Okay. Where did they learn the paths for that migration? They learned it from the Chinese in Mexico. If you go to, there's a place on the border that's called Calexico, California, Mexico. And on the other side of the border, it's called Mexicali, Mexico, California. If you go to Mexicali, even to this day, most of the money exchangers are Chinese. And what they did after the Exclusion Act was they facilitated people coming in from Mexicali through Calexico and creating all these migrant routes into California. Okay? But it originated in Mexico, not the United States. The Chinese figured it out. And later, when the Chinese no longer needed it, they basically incorporated the Mexicans into these routes. How do we know this? Well, there's a very famous Chinese American author by the name of Frank Wong. And he could read Chinese. He went down there and he took these histories of the associations in Mexicali, and he gave them to me, and I had my cousin translate it because I can't read Chinese. Okay. He translated, and we could see the kinds of transactions that they were making. So the Chinese experience in America is greatly influenced by what's going on in Canada and Australia to a large extent. And so one of the things you might want to do one of these days, as you're doing your own research, you might want to see some of the parallels. And it's not only true for Chinese, it's true for Japanese too. Later, if you take the Japanese American experience class, you'll come to something called the Gentleman's Agreement, which limited the number of Japanese who came into the United States. Where did that come from? Was it something that the United States figured out? No. If you go take a look at Canadian history, you find that a year earlier, the Canadian government had implemented the same type of program for the Japanese there, and so it got adopted by the U.S. Now, having said that, all these things are communicating, interlinking. The United States actually still offered the best experience for Chinese coming abroad, because the restrictions in Australia and Canada were so much more severe than it was in the United States. Okay? This is kind of ironic, because the more severe it was, the smaller the population was before the war. Okay? But after the war, because of immigration principles generally adopted by most countries, it was all organized around what Trump calls chain migration. No, it was family migration. Okay. And because the Chinese in the United States and Canada and Australia were denied their families, after the war they were given an opportunity to bring in their families. And the places where the Chinese restriction was the hardest, okay, and that was not the United States, it was Canada or Australia, the Chinese communities grew the fastest. Consequently, in the United States, if you ask how many, we'll do the Asians, what percent of the population, the American population, is of Asian ancestry? Does anybody want to venture a guess?
Isn't it 3%?
Oh no, more higher. Anybody else?
30%.
No, that's way too high. Now you're now you're thinking like a Californian, more or less San Francisco. No, in California it's about 15%. In the United States, it's around 5% now. Okay, but in Canada and Australia, where there are Chinese restrictions, in the Canadian population, the Asians are approximately about 25% of the population, and in Australia, it's about 20%. So it's far larger, and the large majority of that Asian population is Chinese. So it's kind of ironic. More restrictions before the war, after the war, it allowed for greater family formation. And so again, you see the connections between these different communities and how they're interacting with each other. Today, it still exists. If you are Chinese, you can go to any place in the world. Frank Wan has a great line, he says, if you're looking at a telephone directory, go to any city and open it up, and what letters do you look under?
C.
C,
W.
W,
L.
L. And you will find some Chinese. And you will find, if you push hard enough, a relative. Now, when I first heard Frank talk about this, I said, you're crazy. Then my sister, half-sister, went to Germany, and she was giving a lecture. And all of a sudden, she gets a phone call saying, I'm calling for my parents who are your brother and sister. And my half-sister goes, what are you talking about? Well, I don't have any German half-brothers and sisters. She says, can we meet up and we'll show you family photos? Well, they walked into my sister's conference room, and she looked at him, she says, don't bother showing me the pictures. You're my brother and sister. Turns out my father had quite a few illegitimate children. But if I want to know, just look in the directory and I can find these Chinese there. Anne and I went to Italy, and she likes playing with languages, and she was really concerned that she didn't know any Italian. And while she was taking a shower, hotel, I was walking around. And I came back and I said, don't worry, we can get around Italy. I said, why? He said, our hotels are in the middle of Italian Chinatown. So we went down and got soup, and we used our Chinese. Okay. Now, there are significant differences in the Chinese community today as opposed to before. Prior to World War II, almost all the Chinese communities were from southern China. Okay. Hardly anybody from northern China. Why? Remember the shipping. Most of the shipping occurred from southern China out of Hong Kong. And these are the people that settled. So when we go to foreign communities, these older communities, her Toisan still can be used. My wife speaks Toisan, I speak Mandarin. It still can be used. Okay. The newer generation, now they're coming from all of China. Okay, and now they're speaking Mandarin. So my Chinese is now more useful. You think it's funny, when I was growing up in New York City, when I spoke Mandarin, they would not talk to me. Because it was such a strong Cantonese community. And I couldn't understand that stuff, so we ended up speaking English. You know, and they looked at me and they're going, you're Chinese, you don't speak Chinese? I used to be envious because these people could speak 3-4 dialects, right? You speak Toisan, okay, Chungsan, okay, Mandarin, okay, Shanghainese, okay. Yeah, couldn't do that. So the Chinese communities now are very different, but they still remain connected. It's a tie-in that won't go. And we're also now beginning to see the tie-in by the number of Chinese who are going back to China. Now, going back to China, I should point out, doesn't mean that you've ever been there. My son went back to China, doesn't speak any Chinese, doesn't know any Chinese other than, well, meal, Chan, I have no money, I'm hungry, you know, that's it. But Google Translator. He takes pictures of things, it translates. He writes it in English and translates it into Chinese, and that's how he gets around China. But he's a valuable commodity in China. He hasn't capitalized on it yet. He's a valuable commodity because why?
Speaks English.
He speaks English. And the Chinese are trying to get into English-speaking markets. And eventually they're going to, and this is why a lot of Chinese, even though they know no Chinese at all, are going back to China because they have opportunities to use their language skills. But they can only do it because they have these existing connections. You cannot go and say, I'm here, take me. No. You gotta go and say, I know somebody. In Mandarin we call it guangxi. Relationships you have with each other. You always say, who do you know? And they will introduce you to people to give you opportunities and jobs. So when you talk about Asian Americans, you're always talking about these kinds of larger networks and relationships. And among the Chinese, it is very, very strong. It exists among other groups too. The basis of it differ. Okay. Some places it's based on territory, other places it's based on family. Chinese is based mainly on family, and another new phenomenon. Okay. College associations, high school associations. Where we live in Southern California, if you go down to Universal Studios, every weekend, this is no exaggeration, every weekend there is an alumni association meeting. They all went to college together. Why are they keeping in contact with each other? Very simple. To socialize, but also to exchange information. Introduce each other to each other. You have a daughter, I have a son. Maybe they should meet. Now, when I tell people this, they say, oh, that's so Chinese. No, it's not so Chinese at all. I'm a sociologist by training, and there was a very famous sociologist by the name of Domholm, who talked about who rules America in higher circles. What he did was, he went to elite private clubs, in California and the East Coast. And what did he find? He found that these people associated to each other, and this is how they maintained their class ties. They introduced each other to business deals. They introduced each other to potential marriage partners.
The Godfather. The Godfather.
Sort of like The Godfather, but this was supposedly legal.
Yeah.
These are people who are what we would call the super rich. They maintain their connections with each other. But the Chinese had figured that out already. You maintain your relationships, you survive. No relationships, you die. And those relationships, again, were not only national, they had to be international. And they continue on to this day. If you take a look at a Chinese newspaper in Chinatown, it's not only about the U.S. community. They have articles on other parts of the world. They're telling you what is going on in other parts of the world within the Chinese community. Okay? So I'd be more than happy to entertain any kind of questions you have, or any thoughts you have about these kinds of connections, or hear stories about the kinds of connections that your parents have. Because, let me explain something. Migration is not a random process. When people migrate, it's always because they always have a prior connection, the large majority of times. Somebody doesn't go say, oh, I want to go to America, I'll just go wherever I land. No way. They say, I'm going to go to America, my Uncle Jose lives in San Jose, that's where I'm going to go. Oh, San Jose. Okay. It's not a random process. If you ask your parents who you are, if you're an immigrant, you ask your parents, they will tell you, we came because X was already here. Or if not a specific person, there's a Filipino community here. I feel comfortable here. I will settle here. And so all of a sudden, places that had no Filipinos become Filipino town. Fremont, right? Daly City. That didn't happen all that. It's all based on prior connections. So, any questions or comments?
Yeah,
Yes.
you know about parachute kids, right?
Oh, yeah.
That's where you were like talking about how it's like now becoming a popular trend where kids come to America or Canada to gain connections and then are told to go back to their parents too.
Irvine is a very good example of parachute kids. These are people who have money to buy their children homes. And they buy their children homes, and the children live in it. And they even have restaurants that only cater to the parachute kids. The parents give them a monthly sum, and they make sure that food is sent over to the house. Okay? And that's another aspect of that kind of connection that exists. Because many of these people who have money are making their money abroad, and they don't want to come to the United States and give up that lucrative business. So they just send their kids here while they fund them financially. And that's a very, very good relationship.
Yeah. They're even making TV shows about them.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah.
Which one?
I don't know, it's just too sad to look.
It is. There was a very famous case in Orange County that they made a movie on, where these Chinese American students, they were mainly Korean, and they were all very smart kids, all headed for Ivy League schools. And they ended up killing one of their fellow classmates, and they all ended up going to prison. But one of the instigators for this particular group was a parachute kid. His parents were from Taiwan, and he was here all alone, and he thought that the kid that he killed was going to think on him to the FBI because he was running some kind of scam, and so he killed him. And it was a brutal killing. It was not done cleanly, swiftly, because we're talking about teenagers. They didn't know how to kill efficiently.
You're talking about Better Luck Tomorrow?
Yeah, Better Luck Tomorrow.
Yeah.
The Better Luck Tomorrow was a movie based on it. I mean, they died, they put lye down his throat, suffocated, burned his thing. It was brutal. It was a really brutal killing.
So I just had a question, Professor Liu. There's such a diversity among Chinese Americans. And I think you said something like the theme that connects everyone is relationships.
Right. There are actually 4 or 5 major streams within the Chinese community. There are the immigrant Chinese, which has its own 2 streams between those from southern China and then the Mandarin speakers. And they do divide out. You know, they do not live together. Okay, and there's usually a class difference. Many of the southern Chinese still are from working class. Many of the Mandarin speakers are more middle class. Then you have the ABCs, the American-born Chinese, okay, that can't really relate to the immigrant generation. When I was teaching Chinese American experiences, it's interesting. All the older Chinese families, they related to a book called Eat a Bowl of Tea, which was about Chinese in San Francisco, Chinatown. They understood that. They hated Amy Tan. Okay. But all the newer immigrants, they all could relate to Amy Tan's work, and they couldn't relate to Louis Chu's. So there's that ABC foreign-born kind of thing. Then there are coastal differences. We don't think about it often, but there are very strong coastal differences between New York and the West Coast.
Yeah.
But also some differences, I think, between San Francisco and Southern California.
Then
Right?
there's the regional differences. It's not only Southern California, Northern California, Pacific Northwest, all very different. You go to Hawaii and you see the Chinese there, totally different experience. Even the food looks different. You know, when you ask for cha cha, they have this shredded pork and calamari it's very different. And so there are strong regional variations. And now what we're also beginning is get a new stream. We're beginning to get a new stream of Asians coming in from Latin America, Chinese from Latin America. So in Santa Ana, California, there's a place called Fiesta Marketplace. Originally it was owned by Latino-speaking owners. Now almost all of them are owned by Asians. A lot of Korean Americans, a lot of Chinese Americans who speak fluent Spanish. Why? They're coming in from places like Argentina, Brazil, Costa Rica, Nicaragua, Hungary, Honduras, and they're speaking very, very fluent English, Spanish. So these are also Asians, but it's this very strong Latin kind of influence. Now, when I was growing up in New York, there was a strong Cuban Chinese influence, but they weren't large in numbers. But it was always interesting going and getting Chinese food and getting plantains and going, what is it?
I'm just curious, Francis, who do you, in San Francisco, which Chinese American influence do you feel like is the strongest?
Well, historically, it's the Toy-san. But things have changed because you can't really talk about San Francisco as the center of everything anymore. So you have a really changing because, for example, if you're in the South Bay, San Jose, Cupertino, you're talking about more Taiwan and PRC kind of being the ascendant.
Oh, by the way, that's still a division too, between Taiwan and PRC.
Actually, we've had some discussion here about Taiwan. Maybe you could speak to some specifics on that.
Well, the Taiwanese Chinese have, because originally when they migrated to Taiwan, they considered themselves part of China. The local population never considered them part of themselves part of China. There is a separate Taiwanese dialect, which is much closer to southern Chinese dialects than it is to Mandarin. But over time, Taiwan has developed its own kind of outlook and own type of perspective. And they take great pride in the fact that they have accomplished quite a bit economically. Now, if you take a look at Taiwan, it's a population of roughly about 23 million people. But does anybody know where it stands economically? It's about the 15th largest economy in the world. And for a little island, that's a hell of an accomplishment. Okay. Taiwan, Korea, they were known as part of Singapore, they were known as the mini tigers. Okay. Their economies have grown quite a bit. And not in Korea, but in Singapore and in Taiwan, and Hong Kong, it was all Chinese. Okay. And they developed. Now, mainland China still claims Taiwan as a province. The Taiwanese are bitterly resisting it, but they have a problem. And the problem is that economically they're becoming more and more tied to the PRC because it's cheaper to set up factories in the mainland and then export your stuff back and forth the island. And the PRC deliberately made it very easy for Taiwanese to start because they want that more entrepreneurship to come into China. And so they make it very, very easy for them, the kid, to get in. They make it very difficult to get out. Okay. What do I mean by very difficult to get out? Once you invest in China, it's hard moving your capital out of China. It's much easier than it was before, but it's still the case that if you try to take out large amounts of currency, China will prevent you from doing so. Okay. So Taiwan now is caught in this position where politically they want to be separate. Okay, economically, they're tied. Culturally, they're beginning to realize that they also evolved, they're evolving differently. Taiwanese culture, in some ways, is closer to traditional Chinese culture. They took everything that was traditional from mainland China, brought it to Taiwan, right? And they didn't experience the change in social relationships that they did under people. So in many ways, they consider themselves more Chinese. And this was true also when I was growing up. Many Cantonese consider themselves more Chinese than a lot of the newer Chinese coming in. The traditional culture was much stronger in southern China than it was in northern China. Yes? You have a question?
I got a book, about 3 Cuban Chinese generals who helped the revolution at the time, and there was there was a history of, well, I forgot it was like Cuba is like, we have a contract labor to bring all the Chinese in from the South China and Caribbean as well. And it makes me, I also brought the Chinese version because it was translated from Spanish to Chinese and English. Yay! So that and reading it twice, the whole book makes me, oh wow, I never thought the impact of bringing Chinese via the contract laborers would impact Cuba and Caribbean that much.
A little known fact, which he might appreciate. My colleague is from Cuba, and he put together a national exhibit on Cuban music. And he points out that a lot of Cuban jazz involved Chinese musicians. Okay? So that the jazz tradition in Cuba among Chinese is very, very strong. And they introduced it into the Latin music. And so it's kind of interesting. John Zhang, I think, talks about it a little bit. He knows a little bit about that.
Well, actually, when they do the Mardi Gras, so when they lead the march,
Oh, yeah,
they use the sona.
right.
The Chinese double reed trumpet is used in the ritual march parade for Mardi Gras, places like Cuba.
That's right. Good.
Oh, no, this just means 5 minutes. We were only gonna take 5 more minutes. of
Okay,
this.
sure.
Any other comments or questions or observations?
You were talking about the economics of China and how they're spreading children back here, but also I see currently to this day that China is also investing into America and like buying out companies, and they're becoming more popular. If you see in movies, they have advertisements aimed for the Chinese audience. Do you think that China now, suppose, is a huge economic threat for U.S. since they're buying so much of USA companies?
Actually, China's beginning to scale back.
Oh.
I think the Chinese are smarter than the Japanese were.
Mm-hmm.
The Japanese invested hugely into the American economy, and then it crashed, and they lost uncountless total amount of money. Most people don't realize it, but Japan's been in a recession for the last 10 years, and part of it had to do with overinvestment in the United States. And China saw that, and they said, it's time for us to cut back. And so they're slowing it down. They're not so much interested in investing in American industry as they are investing in American technology. China always wants American technology, and I know that firsthand, because and that's not only true of Chinese, but in Singapore and in Taiwan, they engage what is known as reverse engineering.
I think
Flexible patent.
Yeah. My cousin, my cousin's husband ran a speaker company. And I remember him from the United States one time buying all the Boise and Pioneer. I said, why are you buying? He says, he just smiled, he says, research.
I think Hong Kong is also suffering too, economically wise. Yes, the rent was like too damn high.
Yeah.
And because they were I think they were economically tied to Great Britain, I believe. And my older cousin told me that my uncle's company has the technology of 90s. I'm talking big, bulky, big ass computers. Oh yeah, that was a sign that, oh my goodness, Hong Kong needs to scale back a little bit.
Yeah, but Hong Kong's hurting because of Shanghai.
Ouch.
Yeah, Shanghai is beginning to infringe a lot of the economic prerogatives and business that Hong Kong had. And it's hard to imagine, but there are a lot of billionaires in China now. I think China actually has more billionaires than the United States. So, and they're having, again, as in the United States, tremendous gap between the wealthy and everybody else. And it's really getting ridiculous there too. I mean, it's, when I went to visit People's Republic, sometimes these people who are rich, they don't know what the hell to do with it.
They just burning money, but
Like the Prime Minister of Malaysia is accused of stealing $750 billion. Okay, what did he do with the $750 billion? He spent $250 and bought a yacht worth $250 billion that has been confiscated by the United States.
ouch.
So it sits in some harbor over here, but $250 billion. God.
Oh man.
They just don't know what to do with that one anymore. You can only spend so much in your life.
All those tiny towns can definitely use $250 million to.
I had one last question, kind of following on what Christina brought up to say. So given the larger influence of China in the world, how does that affect, are there any effects to be seen in terms of the development of Chinese in America?
Yes. Deng Xiaoping, the former prime minister, came up with a very nice concept about how he sees Chinese in other communities. People always talk about the brain drain, saying, oh, they're taking brain from China and bringing to other parts of the world. Deng Xiaoping said, nah. They're the brain reservoir. And when he was asked to explain, he says, whenever we need them, we can get them back. And so all the development that's occurring among Chinese communities in different parts of the world are subject to being called back. And I don't mean that these people are working for the government. They just make it very lucrative for you to go back. They offer you all kinds of prerogatives. You don't have to drive, they'll give you a driver and a limousine. They'll give you housing. They want you to come back, but they want to control when you come back. And so all these communities now, China sees them as an extension of itself. That's what Western powers are always worried about. That, oh, they're infiltrating us because they have ties to these Chinese communities. And to a certain extent, those ties exist, but it's not infiltration. Okay? It's a tie that says, if we need you, we'll offer you the kinds of prerogatives to come back, and they will come back. When you see some of the deals that they're putting together, you're going to say, I'm yours.
Yeah, so if you're looking for that letter of recommendation.
Well, thank you very much.
Like you guys can stand in
Oh.
the students are in the background.
Oh.
You, right, you like stand
We have
up
to
right-
sit, we have to
right here, that's a good spot.